The morning Genevieve Ashford walked into the wrong conference room changed everything she thought she knew about survival. She'd been running on 3 hours of sleep and cold coffee, her scrubs still carrying the antiseptic smell of the ER, when she pushed open the glass door marked 14B and found herself standing in front of 6 men in suits who've all stopped talking at once. Wrong room. She started to back out. Dr. Ashford. The voice came from the head of the table. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that assumed the room would wait for it. Please, come in. She'd never met Dominic Carver before that morning. Didn't know his name. Didn't know that the building she'd been called to, a routine hospital board meeting, or so her department head had told her, was actually owned by a holding company, that was owned by another company, that was owned by a man who didn't need his name on anything because everyone who mattered already knew it. She stood in the doorway with her coffee cup and her exhaustion and her complete ignorance of what she'd just walked into. It was the last moment of that particular kind of ignorance she'd ever have. She'd come to Chicago 8 years ago with a medical degree, a 1-year-old daughter, and $43 in her checking account after the divorce lawyer's fees cleared. Her mother had called it a disaster. Her ex-husband had called it inevitable. Genevieve had called it Tuesday and gotten to work. 8 years of double shifts and childcare schedules and missed school plays she cried about in parking garages so her daughter Nell wouldn't see. 8 years of building something so solid that no one could take it from her again. She was 34, the youngest attending in the Mercy General Trauma Unit, and she owned half of a 2-bedroom apartment in Logan Square that she shared with a 7-year-old who could already do long division and had opinions about everything. Her life wasn't perfect. It was hers. She stepped into the conference room. "I think there's been a mistake," she said. "I'm here for the board meeting on the trauma unit budget. That meeting was moved." The man at the head of the table, Dominic Carver, though she didn't know it yet, set down his pen. "This one is more relevant to you." She looked at the other men around the table. None of them met her eyes. That was the first warning sign she should have read correctly. "I don't understand." "I know." He stood, 6'1", maybe 6'2", with the kind of dark hair that was going silver at the temples, in a way that looked intentional rather than accidental, late 40s. A suit that cost more than her car. "My name is Dominic Carver. I own this building. I also own the note on Mercy General's expansion loan." The floor shifted slightly beneath her feet. "The hospital's financial situation," he continued, "is considerably worse than the board has disclosed to its medical staff. They've been managing the appearance of solvency for approximately 14 months. You're telling me my hospital is bankrupt. I'm telling you it will be within 90 days unless new management steps in to restructure the debt." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Direct, assessing, completely without apology. "I intend to be that management. What does any of this have to do with me?" He was quiet for a moment. The other men in the room seemed to become furniture. "Your ex-husband," he said, "borrowed money from me 4 years ago. He defaulted. The debt, with interest, is now significant." The antiseptic smell of her scrubs suddenly felt very close. "James doesn't have anything to do with my life. He used your daughter as collateral." The room went completely silent inside her head. She heard the words. Processed them the way she processed information in the ER, fast, clinical, because falling apart was something you did in the parking garage, not in front of the problem. James had borrowed money from this man. James had signed something using Nell's name, Nell's future, Nell's existence as a bargaining chip, because James had always treated the people in his life as things he could spend. "That's not legally enforceable," she said. Her voice sounded steady. She was proud of it. "No." Dominic's expression didn't change. "It isn't. But the people he borrowed from before me, the people whose debt he cleared using my loan, they don't restrict themselves to legal remedies." She understood then. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. James had borrowed from people who hurt children when contracts weren't honored. Dominic Carver had bought that debt, which meant the threat had transferred. "You're telling me my daughter is in danger. I'm telling you she was. Before I purchased the relevant agreements and removed those parties from the equation." He sat back down very deliberately, like he was giving her space to breathe. What I'm offering you now is a more permanent solution, which is, marry me, she laughed. She couldn't help it, a sharp, almost involuntary sound, the kind that escapes before the brain catches up. Excuse me, the hospital stays open, the debt is settled. The parties who might otherwise view your daughter as an outstanding obligation are informed that she is now under my protection, which is a category of protection they understand and respect. His tone didn't shift. In exchange, you become my wife. In name, initially. The arrangement can be revised as circumstances evolve. You're insane. I'm practical. I don't know you. I know. He picked up his pen again. You have 48 hours to decide. Your daughter's school schedule will not be disrupted. You will continue practicing medicine. I'm not asking you to disappear into my life. I'm asking you to let my name stand in front of yours like a wall. She should have walked out. She knew it even then, standing there with her cold coffee and her exhausted rational mind working through the angles. She should have gone straight to a lawyer, then the police, then whoever handled wealthy men who conducted marriages like real estate transactions. But she drove to Nell's school instead, parked across the street, watched the second graders in the yard at recess, little coats and little voices, and the particular chaos of children who had not yet learned to be afraid of anything, and found her daughter immediately, the way she always could, like a compass finding north. Nell was by the fence, explaining something to two other kids with the intense focus she brought to everything. Her dark hair in the crooked ponytail she'd insisted on doing herself that morning. Genevieve sat in her car for 23 minutes. Then she called the number on the card he'd slid across the table. The wedding was at the Carver estate outside of Naperville, a property she hadn't known existed until 4 days before she stood on its lawn in a cream-colored dress she'd bought herself, because she refused to let him do that. 12 people attended. His lawyer. Her mother, who flew in from Phoenix with an expression that could have cured infections. A notary. A few faces she didn't recognize and didn't ask about. Nell held her hand during the ceremony and whispered, "Your dress is pretty, Mom." And Genevieve squeezed back once and thought, I would burn everything down for this kid. Everything. Without hesitation. Dominic Carver said his vows with the same calm efficiency he'd used in the conference room. Genevieve said hers, looking slightly to the left of his face. He noticed. He didn't comment. The first month was architecture. That was the only word she had for it. They were both constructing the structure of living in the same house without occupying the same space. The estate had 12 rooms. She used 4 of them. He used 3. They had dinner together on Tuesdays and Thursdays because his assistant had put it in both their calendars, and Genevieve had decided the only way to survive this was to treat it like a clinical rotation. Show up, observe, don't die. Nell adapted faster than Genevieve expected, which was simultaneously a relief and a source of low-grade guilt. Nell had her own room, enormous by any previous standard, and she approached it the way she approached everything, as a problem to be organized and then enjoyed. She was cautious around Dominic at first, watchful. She had her mother's instincts for evaluating a room. The moment Genevieve identified as the first real shift was a Tuesday night in the second month. She'd come home late from a double shift, 11:40 p.m., and found Dominic in the kitchen and Nell at the kitchen island, both of them bent over a piece of paper. She stood in the doorway unnoticed for 30 seconds. It doesn't make sense, Nell said. She was frowning at the paper with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. If the perimeter is 12, why can't I just subtract? You can. Dominic's voice was different in here, quieter, stripped of its conference room quality. Show me what you get when you do. Nell did the arithmetic. Got it wrong. Frowned harder. Try it again, he said. Slower. I did it slow, slower than that. She did. Got it right. Her face went through the particular transformation of a child who has figured something out. Surprise becoming satisfaction, becoming complete casual confidence, as if she'd known it all along. Oh, she said. Oh, he agreed. Genevieve backed out of the doorway before either of them looked up. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her bag over her shoulder and her scrubs smelling like a 14-hour shift and something happening in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. She told herself it was relief. A child responding to a stable environment. Basic developmental psychology. Nothing more. The second shift happened at 6 weeks in, during a dinner that was not a Tuesday or a Thursday. She'd had a bad day. The honest version, she'd lost a patient. A 31-year-old woman who'd come in with what her husband had described as a fall down the stairs. And Genevieve had known within 90 seconds what kind of fall it was and had done everything she could, and it hadn't been enough. She'd sat in her car for 45 minutes after her shift and then driven home because there was nowhere else to go. She walked into the kitchen to find dinner already on the table. Not elaborate, pasta, bread, the simple kind, but there. Nell was upstairs. The house was quiet in the specific way of someone who has deliberately made it quiet. "Long day," Dominic said. Not a question. She sat down, didn't answer, took a piece of bread and ate it without tasting anything. He didn't push, didn't ask for details. Poured her water and passed the pasta and didn't perform concern at her, which was the thing she hated most when she was holding grief. The performance of it, the way it turned her pain into someone else's moment. They sat in silence for a few minutes. "She was 31, Genevieve said finally. She hadn't meant to. He looked up. "I knew when I walked in. I knew immediately. And I still couldn't." She stopped, pressed her lips together. Dominic set down his fork. He didn't say "I'm sorry" or "that must be so hard" or any of the things people said that meant nothing. He said, "Do you want to talk about it, or do you want someone to just be in the room with you?" She blinked. "Which one actually helps?" he said, "when it's this kind?" She thought about it honestly. "The second one." He nodded once and picked his fork back up, and they sat in silence for the rest of the meal, and it was the most genuinely kind thing anyone had done for her in years, and she hated that she had to acknowledge it. 3 months in, she found the file. She wasn't looking for it. She'd been in his study, he'd told her she could use it, that the bookshelves were available, and she'd run out of things to read. When she pulled out a book and a folder slid out with it, she caught it before it hit the floor, set it on the desk to put back, looked at the tab on the folder. Her name, and Nell's name, and a date from 14 months ago. She sat down. The folder was a surveillance summary. Her address, her schedule, Nell's school, her hours at Mercy General, 14 months ago, before the conference room, before the proposal, before any of it. Her hands were very still on the desk. She went through it methodically, the way she went through chart notes, looking for the diagnosis, not the feeling. What was here? What it meant. He'd had her watched for over a year before he'd ever spoken to her, before he'd walked into her life with a suit and a solution and positioned himself as the rescue. Had he manufactured the crisis or merely prepared for it? She didn't know, and not knowing was worse than either answer. She put the folder back exactly where she'd found it, replaced the book, left the study, made dinner for Nell, put her to bed. Read 2 chapters of the chapter book they were working through together. Something about a girl who discovers a door in her grandmother's garden, and said good night and turned off the light and closed the door. Then she stood in the hallway and decided. She found him in the kitchen. He was reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in, and something in his face shifted, barely perceptible, like he'd already calculated what this conversation was. "The folder," she said. A pause. "Yes. 14 months. Yes." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him and put her hands flat on the table so they'd stop doing whatever they were doing. "Tell me everything. Right now. All of it. I want to know how long you've been in my life without my knowledge and why." He set down his phone. He told her. James had borrowed money from 3 separate organizations before Dominic. The first 2 had been cleared, but not cleanly. Nell's name had appeared in documentation as a secondary asset, something James had apparently offered as a long-shot bargaining chip when his first options closed. Dominic's intelligence network. She noted the word he used, intelligence network, and filed it. Had flagged James's name in connection with a deal they were monitoring for unrelated reasons. When the flag appeared, they pulled the thread. And Nell's name came with it. "You started watching us because of James," she said, "because of a risk that had James at its origin. And the hospital? The loan?" A brief silence. "I accelerated the acquisition of the hospital note when I determined that a direct approach through your professional context would be received more credibly than an approach through your personal life. She absorbed this. You engineered the meeting. I created the conditions for a meeting. That is the same thing. He didn't argue. You built a situation that would make me feel like I had no choice, she said. And then you stood there and called it a practical solution and watched me calculate my way into saying yes, yes. You told me you weren't asking me to disappear into your life. Her voice was level. She'd worked very hard on level. But I was never not already in yours. Dominic looked at her across the kitchen table in a house that had once been just his. I can't undo the decision to surveil. I can tell you that my intention throughout was to prevent harm to your daughter. I can tell you that nothing about our arrangement was designed to hurt you. I can also tell you, he said, that I understand completely if that isn't enough. It's not, I know. She stood up. I'm not leaving tonight. Nell's asleep and her routine matters more than my feelings. But I need you to understand that I am here right now because of my daughter, not because of you. And I am not going to pretend that it's something else. I wouldn't ask you to, and I need the full file. Everything you have on James, on the organizations, on whatever risk assessment you've been running on my life. I need to see it. I'll have it to you by morning. She walked to the door, stopped. One more thing. She turned back. If you ever do something like this again, any surveillance, any information gathering on me or my daughter that I haven't explicitly agreed to, I will burn this arrangement to the ground myself and take my chances. I know how to survive on $43. I've done it. He looked at her for a long moment. Understood. She went upstairs, lay in the dark in her room, not theirs. That was another thing that had never changed, and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the moments she'd credited to coincidence or circumstance that now had to be revised. The file was on the kitchen table when she came down at 5:30 a.m. before her shift, 3 inches thick, her name on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. She took it with her to the hospital and read it in 2 sittings between patients, and by the end of the second sitting she understood 2 things. The threat to Nell had been real, completely, documentably real, and Dominic Carver had been running interference on it for 14 months before she knew his name. Neither of those facts canceled the other out. A week passed, then 2. She made dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays because the structure was useful, even when she hated what it represented. She took Nell to soccer and the library and the Saturday farmers market they'd found 4 blocks from the estate, and Nell spent her allowance on a cactus and a book about weather patterns and was perfectly content. The day things shifted again was a Saturday in November when Nell had a fever and a soccer game she'd been looking forward to for 3 weeks. Genevieve called the coach, handled it, made soup from scratch because that was the ritual, her mother's recipe, the one thing her mother had given her that didn't come with conditions, and set Nell up on the couch with blankets and the remote and went to check her temperature for the 4th time. Normal, or close enough. She was in the kitchen when Dominic appeared in the doorway. He was in what passed for casual on him, no jacket, collar open, and he was holding the paperback that had been sitting on the living room side table. She asked if I'd read to her, he said. Genevieve looked at him. She asked you? She said, and I'm quoting directly, you're just standing there anyway. Despite everything, Genevieve almost smiled. That's very Nell. He held up the book, the same one she and Nell had been reading, The Girl and the Door in the Grandmother's Garden. I don't know where you left off. Page 84. There's a dog ear. He nodded and went back to the living room. She heard his voice a moment later, quieter than his professional register, following the cadence of the sentences. She heard Nell make a sound that meant she approved of the pacing. Genevieve stirred the soup and thought, this is what collateral damage looks like when it doesn't go the way anyone planned. She found him in the study that evening, after Nell was asleep with her temperature down and her cactus on the nightstand. You could have just told me, she said, about the threat 14 months ago. You could have come to me directly. You would have gone to the police. Yes. The police can't do what I can do. I know that. She sat down across from him in the chair she'd started thinking of as hers without meaning to. But I also know that you made the decision that I couldn't be trusted with the truth about my own life. And that's the part I keep circling back to. He was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. It sounded like it cost him something. I assessed you as a variable, someone to be managed rather than partnered with. That was a mistake. It was. I don't make them often. I'm sure that's very comforting to you. Something crossed his face. She'd have called it the beginning of a smile on anyone else. I'm trying to tell you I understand what I did wrong. I know. I'm trying to tell you understanding. It isn't the same as it being okay. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him across the desk in the lamplit room with the bookshelves behind him and thought about the folder she'd found, the surveillance photos, the careful, meticulous architecture of control, and also about a man reading a chapter book to a 6-7-year-old on a Saturday afternoon because a child had asked him to. People, she had learned in the ER, were never one thing. I'm not forgiving you, she said. Not yet. Possibly not for a long time. That's fair. But I'm not leaving either. He looked at her. I'm staying because my daughter is safe and happy and doing long division, and because I'm not stupid enough to walk away from real safety because I'm angry, and because... She stopped, pressed on. And because I think you're trying. I don't know if it's enough yet, but I see it. He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the house settling around them. Thank you, he said finally, for staying, for telling me what I did wrong instead of just leaving. A pause. I'm better at strategy than honesty. I'm aware of it. Work on it. I intend to. She stood. Good night, Dominic. Good night, Genevieve. She paused at the doorway. She's going to want you to finish the book, you know. You read 3 chapters. Now you're committed. He looked faintly alarmed in a way she found deeply satisfying. She went to bed. 5 months later, she told him she loved him in the kitchen on a Thursday morning before anyone else was awake, while the coffee was still brewing and the light was the gray gold of early spring coming through the windows. She didn't plan it. It arrived the way most true things did, without announcement, fully formed, refusing to go back where it came from. He set down his mug. I know that complicates everything, she said. I'm not saying it to change anything. I'm saying it because it's true and I'm done pretending it isn't. He looked at her for a long moment. It doesn't complicate anything, he said. It clarifies everything. He crossed the kitchen, not rushed, not dramatic, the same deliberate, unhurried quality he brought to every movement, and took her face in his hands, and she thought, very briefly, of the conference room where she'd laughed at the word Mary. And then she stopped thinking about it because he kissed her, and it turned out some things didn't need analysis. Nell found them like that and announced loudly that it was about time, with the authority of someone who had been waiting patiently on facts to catch up with what she'd already decided months ago. 2 years after that, on a Sunday in October, Genevieve stood on the back terrace of a house that had stopped feeling borrowed and started feeling like home, watching her daughter run laps around the yard with the determined energy of a 10-year-old who'd decided she was going to train for the school track team and treated every spare moment as practice. Dominic stood beside her, his shoulder against hers. She's going to run out of yard, he said. She'll adapt. She always does. He looked at her sideways. Like mother, don't push your luck. But she was smiling. Nell completed her lap, tagged the fence post she'd designated as her finish line, and threw both arms up. New record, she announced, though there was no previous record to compare it to. Incredible, Genevieve called. Unprecedented. Dominic agreed, and Nell beamed. That evening, after Nell was in bed, Genevieve sat in the study in the chair she'd claimed without meaning to, and Dominic sat across from her, and they were both reading, which was most evenings now. And she thought about the woman who had walked into the wrong conference room 4 years ago with cold coffee and 43 hours without sleep and no idea what she was walking into. That woman had built something good from $43 and stubbornness and love for a 1-year-old she'd have taken apart the world for. She'd done it once. She'd done it again, differently, from stranger materials, with a man she hadn't chosen and had chosen anyway. The lamp made a warm circle. Nell's footsteps moved across the ceiling above them, the particular creak that meant she was getting a glass of water, which was the bedtime delay tactic she'd been using for 3 years and would probably use for 3 more. Dominic looked up at the sound. back down at his book. "She's getting water," Genevieve said. "I know, you're going to go check on her." "I wasn't, you were." A pause. He closed his book, stood up. "I'll be back," he said. She watched him go, listened to his steps on the stairs, heard the low murmur of voices from above, Dominic's and Nell's, a brief exchange, the quiet of the house resettling around them, and thought, this exact thing. The creak of the stairs and the lamp, and the ordinary, unremarkable safety of a Thursday night. This was what she'd walked through fire to build. Not the house, not the name, not any of the external structures that could be taken away. This, the feeling of a child being checked on by someone who meant it. The feeling of a life where the people in it chose to show up. She'd started that choice herself in the cold of a November parking lot, watching her daughter run at recess with no idea that her mother was sitting across the street rearranging everything to make sure she was safe. The choice hadn't stopped. It kept renewing itself every Thursday and every ordinary Sunday, every fever and every long division problem, and every chapter of a book about a door in a grandmother's garden. Love, she'd learned, wasn't a single decision. It was a direction. You picked it, and then you kept picking it, day after day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, until it stopped being a choice and simply became who you were. Dominic came back downstairs, sat back down, picked up his book. "She's fine," he said. "I know," said Genevieve, and she did.